All right, so I'm gonna just kick it off. My first question is, you're also one of the executive producers of this film, and you were one of the consultants. Can you tell us what motivated you, what's the story you wanted to tell, and also in the process, what were you surprised by?
I should use this one, right? Okay. I have both. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. Thank you for taking the time to watch this film. I think it's particularly relevant considering where we are, and also very, very important issue that certainly doesn't receive as much attention as it deserves. I was very grateful to have been invited to be part of this project along with Liberty in North Korea. The filmmakers, there's three producers, Jana, Sue, and Rachel. They originally had a vision to create this based off of a North Korean defector named Hyunseo Lee, her book. If you have read her book or are familiar with it, it's called The Girl with Seven Names. And so she was one of the first North Korean defectors to have shared her story from the TED stage, actually, in the US. And so you can actually go watch her TED Talk online, along with Joseph Kim, who's another North Korean defector who shared his talk online as well. But Hyunseo's story is very compelling. Jana read the book and wanted to share that story because she had never heard of it before. She was a film producer that lived in the Upper East Side of New York City and was just shocked that she had never heard anything about North Korea before. Sue was a good friend of hers and a neighbor, and Sue actually used to work for the CIA for over a decade and worked in government, in and out of government, different think tanks, that still continues to work on the issue. And so she kind of brought Sue into the issue and said, we need to make a film about this. Eventually, they realized that through various different challenges, they decided to actually go a different way and ended up deciding to tell the story about the Underground Railroad and how North Korean defectors are escaping. And they were fortunate to get connected with Pastor Kim, who was kind enough to open up his networks and to allow cameras to come in the underground and to follow them, helping two families in their escape. So I think the intention behind the film was really that even though this is my world and maybe living here in Seoul, you hear a lot about North Korean refugees and about these issues. Elsewhere in the world, when people hear North Korea, the first thing that comes to mind, unfortunately, is still nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un, Dennis Rodman, The Interview, these types of things. And the North Korean story, unfortunately, the story of the North Korean people doesn't really get shared that much. And so one of the things that we always like to say at Link is people over politics. And that the most interesting thing about North Korea is not Kim Jong-un, but it's actually the North Korean people. And we truly believe that they are also one of the best solutions to this issue, which is why we work so closely with them.
Thank you. One of the things that the film, it obviously deals with a lot of the kind of escape from North Korea. One of the things that it maybe doesn't touch on as much is the resettlement, what happens after they escape and they arrive in their destination, whether that's the United States or South Korea. Can you talk a little bit about just, maybe how many defectors have been, leaving, escaping North Korea? How many are there today? How is the trend going over time? How does Link support these defectors to also get settled some of the challenges they might be facing? There are like 6 questions tonight.
All right, I'll try to tackle all of them. As you saw, they arrive in South Korea. The majority of North Korean refugees, defectors, they tend to choose to go to South Korea. And a big part of that reason was from Thailand, it's a much faster processing. So there's kind of a de facto law, but South Korean government doesn't recognize North Korea. North Korean government doesn't recognize South Korea. So by default, they are considered to be kind of South Korean citizens. And so the South Korean government is able to process North Koreans faster from Thailand in Southeast Asia to come to South Korea. North Koreans will then spend up to about 3 months with NIS doing some interviewing, interrogation to verify their background, to gather information. And then from there, they'll move on to Hanawon, the government-run facility for resettlement, which will be another 3 months. So all total, about a month of processing in Thailand, about 3 months at NIS, and about 3 months in resettlement. You're talking about 6-7 months maybe before they're even kind of settled into their own home and kind of living on their own. And so it's quite a long process. But that being said, many will choose to come to South Korea because it is a faster process to leave Thailand, to leave Southeast Asia. There is far more support that the South Korean government provides, more so than in the United States. And also many North Koreans believe coming here will be a bit of an easier settlement because similar, same-ish language, similar, same-ish culture, people, that's sort of the expectation. So to date, there's probably a little bit over 34,000 North Korean defectors who have escaped and resettled in South Korea. Now, some of them have gone on to other places around the world, but the vast majority have resettled here. The United States is the only other place technically that allows North Korean refugees or welcomes them for resettlement outside of South Korea. And this is because in 2004, former President Bush passed the North Korean Human Rights Act, which had a provision in there that said that the United States would offer North Korean refugees an opportunity to resettle as refugees. If they had not included that provision, North Koreans wouldn't have had that way because technically South Korea was willing to accept all North Korean refugees. So starting in 2006, I believe, was the first North Korean refugee to touch ground in the US as a resettled refugee. There's probably only been about 200, a little bit over 270 North Koreans who have legally gone and resettled in the United States as a result of the North Korean Human Rights Act. So that's pretty disproportionate if you think about it. Over 30,000 here, over 250 in the US, and there's probably over a few thousand scattered around the world in different places, and they've gotten there through a bunch of different ways, including some who have come to South Korea first and then utilized their passport to go on somewhere else and then have tried to apply for asylum in other countries. That was, I think, the bulk of the question. In terms of the support, North Korean refugees that go to the US, they receive the same resettlement benefits that any other global refugees that go to the United States receive. So it's not that much because the United States used to accept anywhere from 30 to 70,000 refugees globally, depending on which administration it was. And so they're accepting a lot more into the country, so their benefits are a lot more standard. They'll get placed with an agency. They'll get maybe 4-6 months of healthcare benefits, resettlement support, financial support, housing support. It's not a lot. Here in South Korea, I believe it's still about 5 years. Subsidized housing, you get some financial assistance. There's a lot of uniquely specialized, catered programs, trainings, workshops, things like that for North Koreans who are coming and resettling here. The challenge, as Namju mentioned, is that sadly, many North Koreans might come here and expect that we're the same people. There's a pan-Korean culture and ethnicity that we share. But it's been over 70 years since the peninsula was divided. And sadly, in very recent surveys, as generations have gotten younger, particularly people in their 40s, 30s, and especially now in their 20s, they see North Korea as a completely different country. There's very little to no interest whatsoever in the issue or in North Korea or in North Korean people. And so, sadly, a lot of North Koreans will come. Adjustment is very difficult. One of our North Korean friends said coming to South Korea was like getting in a time machine and fast forwarding 50 years. Like time stopped in North Korea. I mean, you're talking about a place that has no internet and, no contact with the outside world. So imagine coming to South Korea. It's hard for me coming from the US. It's so fast paced. It's so technologically advanced. Everything is such a bari-bari culture. It's so fast. So for North Koreans who come, they don't know what an Americano is or kopi. It's like these terms that sound Korean but are actually English derived. So there's this whole language that sounds Korean, but they're not familiar with. So adjustment can be very difficult, from language to culture to social, job skills based. The difference is very large. And then on top of that, sadly, they can face discrimination. There can be some very negative perceptions here. We've heard so many sad stories of young children who are bullied in their schools. And so it can be difficult, but I don't want to say that is everybody's experience, but we have heard that it is very difficult, for sure.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I would love to open it up to our students. If you have any questions. Yes, in the back.
son was punished. Do you know anything else about him or his status currently?
Sadly, oh yes, sorry. So she asked, even though the son was punished, do we know anything more about his status or where he is? So actually, I had a chance to see Seoyeon today, and we caught up. And unfortunately, she has tried to continue utilizing her networks to see if there are any updates, and she hasn't heard anything yet. So she continues to inquire through her networks to find out any updates. But the kind of prison that her son was put in is quite closed, and it's very difficult usually to get any information in and out of. So our hope, though, is to try to figure out some sort of an advocacy campaign to do a little bit more public pressure on his case. And so we'll let you guys know if we have something soon that you can do to help out.
Thank you. Any other questions from our students before we open?
What's the trickiest escape you've ever experienced?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, what's the trickiest escape I've ever experienced? So that, I'm sorry?
Seen? You've seen or experienced?
Oh, the trickiest escape I have seen others experience. Oh, there's so many. So the vast majority of North Koreans, I would say pre-COVID, would come out utilizing this underground route. After COVID, everything changed, sadly. So it has become significantly more difficult. The underground routes have become very eroded, and the cost has become really volatile, like sometimes 5, 10, 20x the cost it used to be. The kind of craziest escapes have not been through the Underground Railroad. There was a very famous one that people probably saw in the news of the young soldier who tried to cross the DMZ in his escape, and he was shot at. There have been a handful of cases like that. A handful of people have made it across the DMZ, believe it or not. There are some people that we know have made it by boat. They actually were able to cross, they were able to get a boat, secure a boat, and somehow managed to get through and were found by South Korean military in the sea. There have definitely been a handful of other cases, very elite North Koreans, people who had worked for the government, families were part of the top cadres, so their escapes have definitely been a lot more risky, dangerous, not traditional. There's one story in particular, this young man, he was a soldier at the DMZ, and he talked about how it's a very, very difficult hardship post. And he noticed that, none of the kind of like North Korean elite kids never had to go to the DMZ and do that post. And so he said he was very kind of like disillusioned, and he at some point kind of had his aha moment. With a lot of our North Korean friends, we always ask, one of the most curious questions we have is when you had that aha moment, or if anyone's familiar with The Truman Show, I'm dating myself here a little bit, that movie with Jim Carrey, but the moment he hits the wall, a lot of our North Korean friends will have that moment because there's something that changes, like you saw happening to grandma when she actually, after she had escaped, right? But they have this moment where they realized, I've been lied to, this is not true, or it's something that prompts them to eventually want to leave. So this young man, he had that moment when he was doing this hardship post, and it was really difficult in the DMZ. So he finally decided, I can't do this. I'm gonna actually make a run for it. So on one night, it was raining really, really, really hard during the monsoon season, I think. And he said that all the electricity got knocked out. So he made a run for it because, it's electrified fences in the DMZ. He said he ran for it and was like going and was like eventually being shot at. And at some point he said he just kind of like slipped and he like passed out. So he said he was like, and in that moment he said he like, all of a sudden he heard like branches crackling, and he like woke up and he was like, oh my gosh, how long have I been out? He's like, I need to like wake up. And he said that he got so scared and he thought that the North Koreans had crossed and found him. So he said he stood up slowly like this because he heard it from behind. And he like went to go turn around to look, and he said it was a deer that had like cracked a branch. And he got so scared. And he said, I gotta 정신 차려야 돼. He's like, I gotta get my stuff together and let's keep moving. I gotta find I'd find some South Korean soldiers. So he said he eventually moved around and he eventually met some South Korean soldiers, and there were two South Korean soldiers, and they kind of on the megaphone saw him at a distance, and they were a little bit wary, and they like asked this question, like "귀순하십니까?" And so it's not very, the way it's framed is very negative for North Koreans. It's sort of like, are you like surrendering? Are you like kind of, I don't know how to translate it exactly, but sorry? Yeah, are you defecting? And for him, it was a very kind of shocking, he didn't, like, it wasn't positive, so he kind of paused for a moment. He didn't want to answer it. And so he stood there kind of and just kept asking, and the South Korean soldier kept asking, "귀순하십니까? Are you defecting? Are you defecting?" And he just stood there, and so finally the other guy he was with took the megaphone, and he just said, like, "Welcome to South Korea." And he said when he heard that, he fell to his knees and he just started crying. And so that's probably one of the craziest stories that I heard.
Any other, one last question and then we'll open it up to.
How does North Korea receive things, and do they get any shipments?
So in terms of North Korean trade, there is a lot of trade, of course, with China and with other countries as well. I don't know if you're talking about maybe more of the illegal trade, like illegal goods that get in, like South Korean dramas and stuff that get smuggled in. But the same networks that we use to help smuggle people out, brokers and things like that, are the same networks that end up being used to also smuggle in like illegal goods, also smuggle money in. So one of the really interesting things is that North Koreans have been defecting since the late 90s, since the famine, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the things that we realized was this really important factor, this input that was changing North Korean society, was the fact that more than half of the defectors who left ended up being able to reestablish contact with their family members inside and send remittances back home. And so it's not huge money, but it would be maybe they would work really hard, a few part-time jobs, and would try to send $1,000, $2,000 back to their family members inside, all through these underground broker networks that would like smuggle that money in. And of course, probably 40% would get taken off of that for brokers, for their fees and stuff. But the average annual income in North Korea is probably about $1,400 USD. That's nothing. So when they were receiving about $1,000 from their son, let's say, who defected only about a year ago, it was very kind of important and symbolic. It was important for family members. It gave them this kind of economic freedom to be able to buy goods in the kind of the grassroots markets. It gave them ability to like bribe officials, to invest in other entrepreneurial market activities. And so it was really this important thing that we began to see. These types of networks, underground broker networks, were helping to facilitate not only moving people, but moving money, moving goods. And so one other thing is that a lot of Chinese nationals, they can freely move about and going back and forth across the borders. So some of these brokers are they're North Korean, they're like Chinese nationals, like Chosunjok, they're ethnically Chinese but Korean people. And so you have these kind of very elaborate networks, but this is a really important underground system that's playing a role in helping to change North Korean society. It was much more prevalent before COVID. Unfortunately, it's been a lot more difficult to sort of reestablish these kinds of networks post-COVID, but yeah.
Maybe we have time for 2, maybe 3 questions from the rest of the audience. If anybody has questions for him. Yes.
The brokers. It seems like the movie said they're doing it for financial gain, but they're taking risks.
Yeah.
So pre-COVID, how much? Start again.
Just a question.
The movie said that the brokers are doing it for financial gain, but they're taking risks. Pre-COVID, during different stages, how much do they require to take those risks?
Oh, the cost, you mean?
Yeah, cost.
So we kind of, pre-COVID, we used to say the cost was about $3,000 to help one person escape. But that cost incorporates everything from what you would pay brokers to transportation to food to like a small amount for bribes. They have to pay a fee once they get into Southeast Asia for illegally entering the country. So there's all of these are kind of built-in costs, and some people it'll be more expensive and less expensive. So broker fees are built into that. I'd say that like it ranges anywhere. You know, it can range from maybe like a third of that to half of that, depending on where people are moving from, also depending on the person's situation. So sometimes we need to ask brokers to help us more. You have a woman who's 8 months pregnant, she's gonna need a lot more help. You have a woman who's bringing 2 children with her, she'll need help. You know, you saw that journey through the jungle. Somebody who has a baby with them needs more help. An elderly person needs more help. So it really depends on sort of the circumstances and situation. But there is risk for them, for sure. But I think that the risk goes both ways.
Any other questions?
The film was very moving. Just my first question is, would this film perhaps make it more difficult for the underground railroads to help North Koreans going forward?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, I've heard of Link, and I really admire your work, but let me just put it diplomatically, but I think it's hard to believe, but there are a sizable number of South Koreans who have a rather maybe sympathetic, or I call it naive, sympathetic view of North Korea. Have you ever been threatened by those groups?
Mm. So to address your first question, that's always definitely been a concern. I think that's one of the reasons why a film like this was never made before. It's most groups that do this work. I mean, the producers originally approached us and asked us to follow us, and we said no, because we did it, for a variety of reasons, we decided not to, but wanted to stay involved in the project. So we were very grateful that Pastor Kim was willing to come on and was willing to, you know, open up his networks and to do the film together. I mean, very incredibly grateful, because this is absolutely like unfathomable, and I think people need to see this to believe what's happening. But that being said, there was already a lot of information out there from other organizations and from other defectors who have shared their stories about key details around the Underground Railroad. So unfortunately, some of that was already out there. I do think that because of the timing, the route itself has generally already been eroded because of COVID and so much information being out there. You'll notice, though, that they didn't really give very specific details. You don't necessarily know what cities they were in or exactly where those locations were, and that was intentionally done as well. So we were able to help work together with the producers and the filmmaker on trying to anonymize the parts that we could, but still make it, you know, interesting enough for people to get the gist of people were moving and where they were moving from. So no, I don't think that it will deter that. I think there are other factors that are going to make it harder just in general for people to be moving altogether, sadly. To the second question, we've definitely had some encounters with some of those organizations. And in fact, believe it or not, some of them are in the US. And so there was actually an incident recently that I believe is fine to talk about, because it was, you can find this open letter, but one of these particular groups took issue with the film itself and made an effort to try to discredit or undermine the film, which ultimately undermined the film's ability to end up getting nominated for an Oscar. And also for an Emmy and some of these other awards, because I think there are definitely some of these groups, not just in South Korea, but also in the US. We have not been directly threatened by these groups per se, but we know that they exist and that they definitely have extreme views, different views on this issue, and particularly in the types of activities that they maintain.
I think we have time for one last question. And
Could you just be a little bit more specific on what you just said? This group prevented you getting the nomination process for the
Is this a journalist by any chance? So I recognize that this is something I believe is public, and I'd be happy to share actually more information with you offline, and actually connect you with the producers if you'd like to talk to them a little bit more about that. But for what I can share publicly, it is definitely believed that that was a huge factor that scared some of the voters away from being willing to vote for this film to be nominated.
Mike, and then
Can I slip one in? You mentioned that it's very. You mentioned it's very difficult for North Koreans to adjust to society here, and it's understandable. We think, for example, the unemployment rate is 2 or 3 times higher, the suicide rates higher, things like that. With that in mind, and with the fact there's an election coming up in a week or two, what more do you think what would you like to see done to help them more, both on a governmental level and on the social level, both private and social?
I will probably slightly avoid the question on what I would like to see politically, because in this administration, actually, I think in South Korea, one of the greatest challenges is that things will tend to fluctuate quite a bit depending on the administration in terms of its policies on North Korea. And unfortunately, that has an impact on the defector community, on organizations that work on this issue, and sometimes even on the level of support that defectors will get. Sadly, because of COVID, because of the routes being eroded, because of the borders being shut down, I think you asked this question before, during the peak of the refugee crisis in the early mid-2000s, there were probably about 3,000 North Koreans who would make it to South Korea annually. 2,000, 3,000, that was really at the peak of the North Korean crisis. When Kim Jong-un came into power, you look at MOU, the Ministry of Unification's numbers, and that drops by about almost 50%. So Kim Jong-un made it a strategic priority when he came in that he wanted to deter defections. He saw what it was happening. People were defecting, they were talking, they were sharing stories. All of this information from North Korea was suddenly getting out there into the international community, into the world. So you see this huge dip, and then it starts to, you see about 1,500 North Koreans annually down to 1,200, and that number just continues to drop year over year over year. And then when COVID happened, you see that drop to a few hundred, because it was just kind of the remaining people who managed to eke out right before COVID. And then during COVID, you had maybe 60 people make it to South Korea for 2 years. That they were probably coming from other places, not even, for sure, not out of North Korea. Maybe they had already been posted in other places, North Korean laborers, women who had already been trafficked and had been in China, these types of folks who were managing to get out. We're talking about numbers being down at 60. Last year, it finally went back up, and I think went up to maybe 200 or something, I can't remember. But it's small, very small. So when you think about all these government programs that have been set up like this, really trying to cater to serving, 1,000, 2,000, it's a huge jump in a difference. So all that to say, I can imagine it's difficult to also anticipate how many people are going to come, what type of support do we need. And so I don't really think I have recommendations at this point that I could fairly share that I would like to see the government. I think if anything, I just wish that there could be some institutionalized policies or things that are sort of these are don't touch. You have administrations that'll come and go, but these are the things that let's just not touch them for the sake of stability, for, the support in the defector community, for what defectors need, that kind of stuff. But, unfortunately, that's just not the case, because the issue tends to get very politicized, not just in South Korea, even, elsewhere, including the US. Oh, sorry, but could I just answer the second part of that question? Because I think that's a really important question. I think as society, as people, there is a lot we can actually do. We do this exercise with our North Korean friends at this summit that we have, and we bring together South Korean students, North Korean students, international students, and we do this thought exercise, this problem tree, and we say, if we were to send 5 million South Koreans to North Korea tomorrow, and 5 million North Koreans to South Korea tomorrow, what would be the biggest challenges and issues that people would face on both sides? And so you're talking really social and cultural predominantly. And so when we think about this, at least for us organizationally, our vision is that we're working toward the day when 25 million North Korean people are free. We're not prescribing how that's going to happen. Frankly, nobody knows that. But that's what we're working toward, is that the system and the way North Korea is, it cannot remain, right? By helping North Korean refugees escape, all we're doing is dealing with the symptoms of the problem, and that's simply not enough. We're dealing with one of the most difficult, most intractable problems of our time, but one of the issues that deserves global attention and gets so little. And so what are the things we can impact? Well, we may not be able to have a massive impact sometimes on policy or on the infrastructure or what military and governments are going to do, but there are things that we can begin to prepare, and our North Korean friends and our South Korean students, they can begin to prepare to do from a social and cultural perspective. And I think a big part of that is, one, starting with changing the narrative on North Korea. Most people don't care because they just have a very specific narrative on North Korea that is like, Kim Jong-un nuclear weapons, or, it's something that just doesn't involve them or interest them. And I think there's a lack of this kind of connection or perspective or understanding of a North Korean person's story and their experience. So I think there's a role we can all play in helping to change that narrative, whether that's sharing stories, it's inviting North Korean speakers to come here, to meet students, maybe they attend this school, to really be able to have an experience getting to know them. And then I think on that front also is, I would love to see more young people get involved with this issue. I'm old for working on this issue now. It's been like 20 years. And so, we're seeing like a new generation of young activists, young North Korean activists and young South Korean activists. We work with a lot of college students, and it's inspiring. I mean, their ideas are way better than ours are. And frankly, this issue needs far more creativity and entrepreneurialism. And that's something that's been really exciting to see here in South Korea, is the level of entrepreneurship and the excitement around that, around business. But I hope to see that more around social impact, because I think we definitely see that much more overseas and in the States. But I think there's an opportunity to see that here a lot more with, young students that are here in South Korea, and especially with young South Koreans.
That was basically my question. I was going to ask, what can we do basically as people, like as normal individuals to help?
Yeah, exactly that. If we have, I'm pretty biased, but I think we have a pretty good social media, a plethora of different social media channels, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, whatever. So many resources out there, so many YouTube channels run by North Koreans today, like things that we can be sharing. You can host a screening of this with your friends at home, with your community or small groups or book clubs, and help raise awareness. If students here want to start a link chapter, wouldn't be the worst idea. But, you can fundraise and you can provide support to North Koreans through our programs. So many other North Korean organizations here. You can volunteer. There's teaching English opportunities through our organization, other organizations. So there are a lot of things you can do if you just want to talk to somebody about it, or you want to go the whole gamut and maybe come work on the issue. And you have some really great ideas for what we can do.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking around way past the time. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.